It was on a grey November afternoon, when the London fog pressed against the windows of our modest flat like an unwelcome visitor, that Hercule Poirot received what would prove to be one of the most perplexing invitations of his distinguished career. I found him, as was his custom, at precisely 4 o'clock, arranging his already immaculate desk with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Each pen occupied its designated position, each paper aligned to mathematical perfection, each surface gleaming as though it had been polished by angels themselves. "Hastings, mon ami," he said without looking up from his task, "observe how the smallest disorder can corrupt the entire harmony of one's environment. This morning I discovered that my paperweight had been displaced by exactly 3 millimeters from its proper position. 3 millimeters. It was like discovering a discord in a symphony by Mozart." Before I could respond to this characteristic observation, our landlady, Mrs. Pearson, knocked and entered with the afternoon post. Among the usual correspondence lay an envelope of exceptional quality, heavy cream paper with a watermark that caught the light, sealed with dark blue wax bearing an elaborate coat of arms. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest as he lifted the envelope with the delicacy of a connoisseur examining a rare vintage. "Observe, Hastings. The paper, it is of the finest quality. Handmade, I would venture. The seal, authentic wax, not the modern substitutes, and the scent." He brought the envelope close to his aquiline nose. "Ah, yes. Lily of the valley. Very faint, very expensive. This is not the correspondence of a person who economizes." With his ivory letter opener, he slit the envelope with surgical precision and withdrew a formal invitation card. His eyebrows rose as he read, and I observed that characteristic stillness that came over him when his little grey cells encountered something truly intriguing. "Most fascinating," he murmured, passing the card to me. "What do you make of this, mon ami?" The invitation was elegantly engraved in the finest script. "Lord Pemberton Ashworth requests the honour of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's company at dinner on Friday the 15th of November at 8 o'clock. Ashworth Hall, Surrey, RSVP. A matter of the utmost delicacy requires your particular expertise. Please bring Captain Hastings. His forthright nature will prove invaluable." The signature below was bold and confident, Pemberton Ashworth. "I confess I don't see anything particularly unusual about it," I said, though something in Poirot's manner suggested I was missing something significant. Apart from the flattering reference to my forthright nature, which I suspect is a polite way of calling me blunt. "Your honesty, Hastings, is indeed a mirror in which people see themselves clearly," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "But you have not observed the date of the postmark." I examined the envelope more carefully. The postmark was clear. November 14th, yesterday. Well, that seems perfectly normal for an invitation to tomorrow's dinner. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, mon ami. Lord Pemberton Ashworth died 6 days ago." The words struck me like a physical blow. "What? But that's impossible." "Precisely what makes it so interesting." Poirot moved to his filing cabinet and withdrew a newspaper clipping. "The Times, November 10th. Lord Pemberton Ashworth, noted philanthropist and collector of antiquities, died suddenly at his Surrey estate following a brief illness. He was 63. The funeral was held 3 days ago." I stared at the invitation in my hands, feeling as though the very paper had become somehow sinister. Then this is someone's idea of a macabre jest. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is something far more intriguing. Poirot consulted his pocket watch. "It is now 4:30. If we are to reach Surrey by 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, we must make our preparations. I've decided to accept this invitation from beyond the grave. Surely you're not serious." "But I am entirely serious, Hastings. Consider the possibilities. Either we are dealing with an elaborate hoax, in which case the perpetrator has gone to considerable trouble and expense to create their deception, or—" He paused dramatically. "Or what? or Lord Ashworth anticipated his own death and arranged for this invitation to be sent posthumously. In either case, the psychology behind such an action is fascinating. The little grey cells, they are already beginning to work. The journey to Ashworth Hall. The following evening found us travelling through the Surrey countryside in a hired motor car, the November fog growing thicker as we left London behind. Our driver, a taciturn fellow named Jenkins, seemed increasingly nervous as we approached our destination. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said as we turned through elaborate iron gates, "but there's been talk in the village about strange goings-on at the hall since his lordship passed. Lights seen in windows that should be dark and the like." "The imagination of country folk," I said dismissively, though I confessed the fog-shrouded estate with its ancient trees and Gothic architecture did little to lift my spirits. Ashworth Hall loomed before us through the mist, a magnificent Tudor mansion with tall chimneys and mullioned windows that glowed warmly in the darkness. Despite its grandeur, there was something unsettling about the place, as though the very stones held secrets they were reluctant to reveal. We were greeted at the door by a butler whose dignity remained unshaken despite the peculiar circumstances. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said with a bow. "I am Graves. Lady Ashworth is expecting you in the drawing-room." The gathering of suspects. The drawing-room was a study in understated elegance, its panelled walls lined with family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our movements. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows that made the assembled company appear almost spectral in the flickering light. Lady Margaret Ashworth rose to greet us, a woman of perhaps 50, with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes that held both grief and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I must confess, I was uncertain whether you would actually come." "The invitation was most compelling, madame," Poirot replied with a slight bow, "though I confess to some confusion regarding its origin." A shadow crossed her features. "Yes, well, that is part of what we must discuss. But first, allow me to introduce the other guests." She led us through the room, making introductions with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to society. There was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the family physician, a man of 60 with kind eyes but nervous hands that betrayed some inner turmoil. Miss Violet Ashworth, the deceased lord's niece, a striking woman of 30 with auburn hair and a manner that suggested both intelligence and carefully controlled emotion. "And this is Mr. James Whitfield," Lady Ashworth continued, indicating a distinguished gentleman with silver temples, "my late husband's business partner and oldest friend." Whitfield's handshake was firm, but I noticed his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "A pleasure, gentlemen, though I must say the circumstances are rather unusual." Near the window stood a younger man whom Lady Ashworth introduced as her stepson, Charles Ashworth. He was perhaps 28, with the restless energy of someone uncomfortable with formal gatherings. "I still think this is all rather ghoulish," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Charles, please," Lady Ashworth said sharply. The final member of the party was Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained curiosity. "I was Lord Ashworth's secretary for 30 years, she explained. "I knew his handwriting better than my own." The mystery deepens. As we settled into comfortable chairs around the fire, Lady Ashworth produced an envelope identical to the one Poirot had received. "We all received these invitations," she said quietly. "Posted yesterday, signed in my husband's own hand, inviting us to a dinner party that he could not possibly have arranged." Poirot examined the invitation with his magnifying glass, studying every detail with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. "The paper, it is identical to mine. The ink, a particular shade of blue-black, rather expensive. And the scent," he inhaled delicately, "lily of the valley, just as before." "That was Pemberton's favourite cologne," Lady Ashworth said softly. He had it specially blended by a shop in Jermyn Street. Most interesting, and you are certain this is your husband's handwriting? Mrs. Fairchild leaned forward eagerly. Absolutely certain. I've seen that signature thousands of times. The particular way he forms the P in Pemberton, the flourish on the A in Ashworth, it's unmistakably his. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. There must be some rational explanation. Perhaps Pemberton prepared these invitations before his death and arranged for their posting. Impossible, Charles Ashworth interjected. Father died suddenly. There was no time for such elaborate preparations. Poirot's eyes moved from face to face, studying each expression with the intensity of a painter capturing a portrait. Tell me, he said finally, was Lord Ashworth in the habit of playing practical jokes? Never, Lady Ashworth replied firmly. He was the most serious man I've ever known. He considered frivolity a waste of time. Then we must assume that someone else has gone to considerable trouble to create this mystery, Poirot mused. But why? What purpose could such an elaborate deception serve? As if in answer to his question, Graves appeared in the doorway. Dinner is served, my lady, he announced, and may I say, the table has been set for exactly 8, as specified in the instructions. Instructions? Poirot's eyebrows rose. What instructions? Graves looked uncomfortable. A note was found in his lordship's study this morning, written in his hand. It specified the seating arrangement for tonight's dinner and requested that his place at the head of the table be set as usual. Lady Ashworth went pale. You didn't tell me about any note, Graves. I thought it best to follow the instructions without troubling you further, my lady. The note was quite specific about the arrangements. Poirot rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a dancer. I think, mes amis, that this dinner party will prove most illuminating. The dead, it seems, have very particular ideas about hospitality. As we moved toward the dining room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap, one set by a man who had somehow managed to continue pulling strings even from beyond the grave. The fog pressed against the tall windows like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 8 times, marking the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most extraordinary evenings of our lives. The game, as they say, was afoot, though in this case, the game master appeared to be playing from the other side of eternity itself. The dining room at Ashworth Hall was a testament to centuries of refined taste, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that danced with the flickering light of massive silver candelabras. The mahogany table, polished to mirror perfection, stretched before us like a dark lake, its surface broken by islands of gleaming crystal and silver. But it was the head of the table that commanded every eye, Lord Pemberton Ashworth's place, set with meticulous precision as though he might materialize at any moment to claim his seat. Graves directed us to our positions with the solemnity of a funeral director, consulting a small card that bore, I noticed, the same bold handwriting we had seen on the invitations. Lady Ashworth took her customary place at the foot of the table, her composure admirable despite the tremor in her hands as she unfolded her napkin. Poirot positioned himself where he could observe every face, his green eyes already cataloguing the subtle tensions that rippled through the assembled company. This is absolutely ghoulish, Charles Ashworth muttered, staring at his father's empty chair with undisguised revulsion. I won't be party to this macabre charade. Before anyone could respond, he thrust back his chair and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Charles has always been dramatic, Lady Ashworth said quietly, though I detected relief beneath her apologetic tone. Perhaps it is better this way. Indeed, Poirot murmured, making a note in his small book. 7 becomes 8 again, in a manner of speaking. Most interesting. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. The boy is upset. We all are. This entire evening feels like something from a Gothic novel. Yet here we remain, Miss Violet Ashworth observed with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps we are all more curious than we care to admit. The first course was served with Graves' customary precision, though I noticed he ladled soup into Lord Ashworth's bowl with the same careful attention he showed the living guests. The ritual was so perfectly executed that for a moment the empty chair seemed less conspicuous. The menu, Lady Ashworth explained, follows Pemberton's exact preferences. He was most particular about such things. Her voice carried a note of forced normalcy that fooled no one. A man of precise habits, Poirot observed, tasting his consommé with appreciation. Tell me, did he often plan so far in advance? Father planned everything, Miss Violet replied. Even his charitable donations were scheduled years ahead. He said spontaneity was the enemy of efficiency. James Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. Pemberton could be inflexible in his arrangements. Once he made a decision, it was difficult to persuade him otherwise. Difficult for whom, Mr. Whitfield? Poirot's question was gentle, but I saw the businessman's jaw tighten. For anyone who disagreed with him, came the careful reply. As the second course arrived, Graves approached with a silver salver bearing 7 sealed envelopes. As instructed, my lady, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. To be delivered with the fish course. Lady Ashworth went pale. What instructions? A note was found in his lordship's study this morning, written in his hand. It specified the timing precisely. Mrs. Fairchild leaned forward eagerly. May I see the note? I'm afraid it was. Consumed in the fireplace after reading as instructed, Graves replied with obvious discomfort. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. How very thorough, and the key to the study. Where is it normally kept? In the bronze St. George on the mantel, Graves answered. His lordship's habit, everyone in the household knew. Tiens, Poirot murmured, accepting his envelope with the delicacy of a surgeon handling a scalpel. We opened them in silence, the only sound the whisper of breaking wax. My message was brief but chilling. The account must be settled. Around the table, I watched faces change as each person absorbed their private communication. Dr. Hartwell's complexion went ashen. Whitfield's hand trembled as he folded his note away. Miss Violet frowned thoughtfully, while Mrs. Fairchild's eyes darted toward the empty chair as though expecting ghostly approval. Well, Lady Ashworth said, her voice carefully controlled. It seems my husband has more to say to us. Indeed, Poirot agreed, though he had waited to open his envelope until he had observed every reaction. And what he has to say appears to be personal to each of us. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep voice seeming to resonate with authority. As if summoned by the sound, Graves reappeared, carrying an ornate key. His lordship's final instruction, the butler announced. At 9 o'clock precisely, Monsieur Poirot is to open the locked cabinet in the study and read aloud the letter contained within. Poirot rose with fluid grace, his eyes bright with the peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. Then let us not keep the dead waiting, mes amis. In my experience, they are the most punctual of all dinner guests. The study at Ashworth Hall was a testament to its late owner's character. A room where every object spoke of meticulous control and unwavering order. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookcases lined the walls, their leather-bound volumes arranged with mathematical precision according to subject, date, and height. Not a single tome was out of place, not a speck of dust marred the gleaming surfaces. The massive oak desk dominated the center of the space, its surface bearing only the essential implements of correspondence. A crystal inkwell filled with blue-black ink, a gold fountain pen positioned at precise right angles, and a leather blotter that bore the faint impressions of careful penmanship. Poirot moved through the room with the deliberate grace of a connoisseur examining a masterpiece, his sharp green eyes cataloguing every detail with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. The very air seemed to hold the essence of Lord Ashworth's personality. Disciplined, controlled, and utterly unforgiving of disorder. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, approaching the locked cabinet that stood against the far wall like a sentinel guarding state secrets. Even in his private sanctuary, Lord Ashworth maintained perfect order. "See how the papers are arranged, how each pen occupies its designated position. This is the retreat of a man who believed that chaos was not merely undesirable, but morally reprehensible." The cabinet itself was a masterpiece of Georgian craftsmanship, its walnut surface gleaming with the patina of centuries. Elaborate brass fittings caught the lamplight, and the lock bore the fine scratches of frequent use. Graves presented the ornate key on a silver salver with the reverence of a priest offering communion, his usually steady hands betraying the slightest tremor. Poirot accepted the key with characteristic precision, examining its intricate wards before inserting it into the mechanism. The lock turned with surprising smoothness, as though it had been recently oiled, and the cabinet doors swung open to reveal shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers, each labeled in Lord Ashworth's distinctive handwriting. But it was the single envelope propped against the front shelf that commanded immediate attention. Heavy cream paper, sealed with dark blue wax, bearing the familiar Ashworth coat of arms. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, lifting the envelope with the delicacy of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact. The paper, the seal, the scent of lily of the valley, identical to our dinner invitations in every particular. He paused, inhaling delicately. Yet the scent is stronger here, more pronounced, most curious. Dr. Hartwell stepped closer, his medical training evident in his clinical observation. "The wax appears fresh, certainly not 6 days old. Someone has been in this room since Pemberton's death." "But the study has been locked since the funeral," Lady Ashworth protested, her voice tight with strain. "Graves has the only key." Mrs. Fairchild cleared her throat delicately. "Not the only key, my lady. Lord Ashworth kept a spare in his bedroom safe. He was most particular about having access to his sanctuary at all times." "And who possessed the combination to this safe?" Poirot inquired, though his tone suggested he anticipated the answer. "The family members," Whitfield replied reluctantly. Pemberton wasn't secretive about such domestic arrangements. Miss Violet's laugh held no warmth. "Uncle Pemberton trusted us with his combinations, but not with his true thoughts. Rather telling, don't you think?" Poirot broke the seal with surgical precision, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. The envelope contained several sheets of the same expensive paper, covered in Lord Ashworth's bold handwriting. As his eyes moved across the first lines, I observed that characteristic stillness that came over him when his little grey cells encountered something of particular significance. "It appears," he said finally, "that our host has orchestrated this evening with purposes far more complex than mere hospitality." Clearing his throat, he began to read in that clear, formal tone that could invest even the most mundane correspondence with gravity. "To my wife, my niece, my son, my friend, my physician, and my faithful servants. If these words are read in my house at the 9th hour of the evening, it is because a certain matter, which I could not resolve in life without causing considerable distress, now presses urgently for resolution. I have of late felt unwell in a manner that troubles me greatly. The symptoms have been peculiar, and their timing most suspicious. I have spoken of my concerns to Dr. Hartwell, who has assured me that my condition is of a passing nature. Perhaps he is correct, perhaps he is not. I make no accusations, but I record that on the evening of the 2nd instant, I partook of brandy in this very room and was taken most violently ill within the quarter hour. I ordered the decanter removed. I found it mysteriously replaced the following day. I have recently completed arrangements with my solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves, regarding certain changes to my will. These modifications concern the disposition of my collection of antiquities, which I intend to place in trust for the Temple Foundation. Some among you will approve of this decision, others will not. I have also caused certain financial accounts to be thoroughly examined, and I will not suffer irregularities to pass unnoticed. The account must be settled. To those who have served me faithfully, you have my gratitude. To those who have betrayed that trust, well, truth has a way of illuminating even the darkest corners. Monsieur Poirot, if you honor this invitation, I trust you will apply your considerable talents to discerning the truth of matters. I have long admired your exactness of mind and your understanding of human nature. Whether I'm a foolish old man seeing shadows where none exist, or whether my suspicions have foundation, only time and careful investigation will reveal. The answers you seek lie within this room, for those with eyes to see them. I remain your obedient servant, Pemberton Ashworth. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the steady tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of fog against the tall windows. Each person seemed frozen in place, as though Lord Ashworth's words had transformed the very air into something thick and oppressive. Lady Ashworth's face had gone pale, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. "This is monstrous," she whispered, "to cast such shadows over us all, even from the grave." "He mentions no names," Whitfield said defensively, though his voice carried an edge of anger. "These are the ramblings of a sick man, nothing more." Dr. Hartwell wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, his usual composure clearly shaken. Pemberton had become increasingly suspicious in his final weeks. I attributed it to the stress of his illness, but perhaps... "Perhaps what?" Miss Violet demanded, her usual composure cracking slightly. "That one of us is a poisoner, that we've been systematically murdering Uncle Pemberton. It's absurd." Mrs. Fairchild had removed her spectacles and was polishing them with minute care, her eyes not meeting anyone's gaze. "He was very particular about his brandy," she said quietly. "French cognac, a specific vintage. He allowed no one else to serve it." Poirot had been listening to these exchanges with the intense concentration of a conductor following a complex symphony. Now he moved to the desk, his attention drawn to the leather blotter. Lifting it carefully, he held it to the lamplight, tilting it so that the nap of the paper caught the illumination at an angle. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "Paper, it seems, is not as discreet as one might wish. It retains the impressions of secrets long after the ink has dried." "What do you see?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "The shadow of words, mon ami. A fragment here, a letter there. Someone has been writing at this desk quite recently." He replaced the blotter with characteristic precision, then moved to examine the bronze St. George that stood upon the mantel. The figure wobbled slightly under his touch, and he steadied it with a small frown of distaste. "Graves," he said suddenly. "When was this room last cleaned?" The butler's dignity remained unshaken despite the circumstances. "Yesterday morning, sir, as always. I personally dust the study each day at precisely 9 o'clock. Yet this bronze figure is not secure upon its base. Most curious for a room cleaned with such regularity." Poirot's eyes moved to the fireplace, where the ashes of a recent fire lay cold in the grate. "And someone has burnt papers here quite recently. The ash is still fine, not yet settled." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Someone had been in this room since Lord Ashworth's death. Someone with access to the spare key. Someone who had reason to destroy evidence and disturb the careful order of the dead man's sanctuary. "It seems," Poirot said finally, folding the letter with meticulous care, "that our dinner party has become something rather more serious than a posthumous social gathering. A dead man has set a trap, mes amis, and we are all caught within its mechanism. The question that remains is this: which among us is the prey, and which is the predator?" As if summoned by his words, the grandfather clock in the corner chimed the half-hour, its deep voice seeming to resonate with ominous authority. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked, and the wind moaned through the ancient timbers of Ashworth Hall like the voice of the dead man himself, demanding justice from beyond the grave. The return to the drawing-room was marked by a silence so profound it seemed to press against the very walls of Ashworth Hall. The fire had burned lower during our absence in the study, casting longer shadows that danced across the assembled faces like phantoms seeking substance. Each person had retreated into their own thoughts, their expressions carefully guarded, yet I could see that Lord Ashworth's posthumous letter had stripped away the thin veneer of polite grief, exposing raw nerves of suspicion and fear beneath. Poirot moved through the room with characteristic precision, his green eyes cataloguing every detail with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The very air seemed charged with unspoken accusations, and I noticed how carefully each person avoided meeting the eyes of their companions. "If you please," Poirot said, settling into his chair with fluid grace, "I should like to examine more closely the individual messages you received with the fish course. These personal communications from our departed host may prove most illuminating." There was a collective stillness, a moment of reluctance that spoke volumes about the contents of those sealed envelopes. One by one, with obvious reluctance, the folded notes were surrendered to Poirot's careful hands. James Whitfield hesitated longest, his jaw tight with some inner struggle before finally placing his message on the growing pile. Poirot arranged them in a neat row upon the mahogany side table, then lifted each envelope to his aquiline nose with the delicacy of a wine connoisseur examining a vintage. "Most interesting," he murmured. "They are not identical in their composition, though the paper and wax are uniform. Each bears that distinctive scent of lily of the valley, yet the intensity varies slightly." He opened each note with surgical precision, reading silently before speaking aloud. "Mrs. Fairchild, 30 years of service deserves truth. Dr. Hartwell, the dose must be correct. Mr. Whitfield, the ledger will be examined. Miss Violet, the trustees must act without fear. Lady Ashworth, the house must be set in order. And for our good Graves, loyalty is obedience to the last." "Mine," I interjected, unable to suppress a slight shiver. "Read simply, the account must be settled." Rather ominous for someone who owes Lord Ashworth nothing. "Precisely, mon ami, and yet the phrase appears again in his letter to us all." Poirot's fingers moved over the papers with practiced skill. "Each message is calculated, personal, designed to strike at the heart of some particular concern or guilt." Lady Ashworth's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "This is monstrous, to cast such shadows over us all, even from the grave." "Perhaps monstrous," Poirot agreed gently. "Or perhaps the desperate action of a man who felt his time was short and his options limited." He turned to Mrs. Fairchild. "Madame, you knew Lord Ashworth's handwriting as intimately as your own. Could these be forgeries?" Mrs. Fairchild examined the notes with the concentrated attention of a scholar studying sacred texts. "They are his hand, down to the pressure on the long downstrokes and the particular flourish on his capital letters. But the ink—" She paused, frowning. "It seems darker than he ordinarily used, and somehow fresher." "Blue-black ink, very fresh indeed," Poirot observed. "Which suggests these messages were written quite recently, not weeks ago when a dying man might have prepared such communications." Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his medical bag clutched tightly in his lap like a shield. Pemberton had become increasingly paranoid in his final weeks. He questioned every symptom, demanded explanations for every minor discomfort. I attributed his fears to the natural anxiety of a man facing his own mortality. Yet his fears, it seems, may have had foundation, Poirot replied. "Tell me, Doctor, when you removed the brandy decanter from his study on your medical advice, who knew of this action?" "The household staff, certainly. Lady Ashworth, I may have mentioned it to Whitfield during one of our conversations about Pemberton's health." The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I thought strong spirits inadvisable given his digestive complaints." "And yet the decanter reappeared the following day," Poirot continued, "most curious for an object that had been medically prescribed." Before Dr. Hartwell could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit Charles Ashworth. His earlier agitation had been replaced by a grim determination, though his eyes still held the redness of recent drinking. "I've been walking in the grounds," he announced, "trying to clear my head, but I've decided I cannot simply flee from this madness." "Your return is most timely," Poirot observed. "I was just discussing the mysterious reappearance of your father's brandy decanter." Charles' face flushed, but he met Poirot's gaze directly. "I replaced it. Father enjoyed his evening brandy. It was one of his few pleasures. Dr. Hartwell's prohibition seemed unnecessarily harsh. Even though your father became violently ill after consuming brandy from that very decanter." Poirot's tone remained gentle, but I recognized the steel beneath the silk. "I thought it was coincidence," Charles said defensively. "Father had a sensitive stomach. The brandy had been his nightly ritual for years without incident." Miss Violet turned from her position by the fireplace, her expression thoughtful. "Charles, you knew about the will changes, didn't you? About the Temple Foundation?" The question fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of tension across every face. Charles's composure cracked slightly. £2 million, he said bitterly. The entire collection, donated to strangers while his own son was expected to live on a clerk's wages. Father had cut my allowance by half, said I needed to learn fiscal responsibility. Lady Ashworth went pale. "Charles, surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Charles interrupted. "I'm stating facts. Father's will left the bulk of his estate to charitable foundations, with minimal provisions for his family. £2 million worth of antiquities to people he'd never met, while those who had served him faithfully were left with scraps." James Whitfield poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, his hand steady despite the circumstances. The Temple Foundation was a recent obsession of Pemberton's. He'd never shown any interest in archaeological preservation before. The decision came as quite a surprise to all of us, particularly given his previous commitment to our business ventures. "Ventures that required considerable capital investment," Poirot observed. "Investment that would no longer be available if Lord Ashworth's collection was tied up in a charitable trust." Whitfield's face flushed an angry red. There were disagreements, yes. Pemberton had become erratic in his business decisions. But that hardly makes me a murderer. "Indeed not," Poirot agreed, "though it does provide what the police would call motive." He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, studying the family photographs arranged there with mathematical precision. "Mrs. Fairchild, you mentioned that Lord Ashworth allowed no one else to serve his brandy. Yet surely there were occasions when others might have access to his decanter?" The elderly secretary adjusted her spectacles nervously. He was very particular about his evening ritual. But if he was engrossed in correspondence or research, he might ask Graves or myself to fetch his glass. Always from the decanter on his desk, never from the drinks trolley in the drawing-room. "His desk," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "The same desk where we found evidence of recent writing, the same study where papers had been burned in the fireplace. Most illuminating." Before anyone could respond to this observation, Graves appeared in the doorway with his customary dignity intact, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of urgency. "But Constable Morrison from the village has arrived. He reports that someone has broken into the family mausoleum." The words struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Lady Ashworth rose unsteadily to her feet, her face ashen. "Broken into? But why? What could anyone possibly want from—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock chimed 11 times, marking another hour in what was proving to be one of the most extraordinary evenings of our lives. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. "It seems," he said quietly, "that Lord Ashworth's posthumous arrangements extend beyond dinner invitations and accusatory letters. Someone, it appears, has urgent business with the dead. The game was indeed afoot, but the rules were becoming more complex with each passing moment, and the stakes were rising far beyond anything we had initially imagined. The journey across the fog-shrouded grounds of Ashworth Hall felt like a descent into the pages of a Gothic novel. Our small procession moved in silence along the gravel path, the crunch of our footsteps muffled by the thick November mist that clung to the ancient yew trees like ghostly shrouds. Constable Morrison, a practical village policeman whose usual duties rarely extended beyond petty theft and public drunkenness, led the way with his lantern, casting wavering circles of yellow light that seemed only to emphasize the impenetrable darkness beyond. Lady Ashworth had insisted on accompanying us, despite my protests, her chin set with that particular determination of someone who had reached the limits of fear and would retreat no further. Dr. Hartwell hovered protectively at her elbow, while Miss Violet followed with the pale composure of someone steeling herself for fresh horrors. Even the dignified Graves maintained his position in our grim parade, his lantern held high like a beacon against the encroaching shadows. The violated sanctuary, the Ashworth Mausoleum, stood in a grove of ancient oaks, a testament to Victorian grandeur built of grey granite that seemed to absorb rather than reflect our lamplight. Its Gothic arches and elaborate stone carvings gave it the appearance of a miniature cathedral, while gargoyles leered down from the corners with expressions made even more sinister by the dancing shadows cast by our lanterns. Found the door standing open when I made my rounds at 10:30. Constable Morrison explained, his voice carrying the nervous edge of a man confronting something well beyond his usual experience. Lock's been expertly picked, not forced. This was done with proper tools and considerable skill. Poirot approached the violated entrance with his characteristic precision, examining the heavy bronze door that hung askew on its ancient hinges. His green eyes moved methodically over every detail, cataloguing evidence with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "Most instructive," he murmured, running his fingers along the damaged mechanism. "The work of someone familiar with such devices, yet accomplished without crude force. This speaks of premeditation, not desperate impulse." He lifted his lantern to examine the stone lintel above the door. "And observe, mes amis, the dust has been disturbed here quite recently. Someone has entered this sacred place within the last few hours." The interior of the mausoleum struck us with its solemn grandeur. Marble tablets lined the walls bearing the names and dates of generations of Ashworths, while stone sarcophagi occupied the center of the space, their carved effigies staring eternally toward the vaulted ceiling. But it was the newest addition that commanded our immediate attention. Lord Pemberton Ashworth's bronze casket, placed on a marble bier while the family's permanent memorial was being carved. The casket had been disturbed. The evidence speaks. The sight of the partially opened casket struck our party with the force of a physical blow. Lady Ashworth swayed and would have fallen had not Miss Violet caught her arm, while Charles Ashworth, who had rejoined us at the mausoleum entrance, cursed under his breath. Even the stolid Constable Morrison seemed shaken by this ultimate violation of the dead. Poirot, however, approached the desecrated casket with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a patient. "The lid has been carefully lifted and replaced," he observed, his voice carrying no trace of the revulsion that gripped the rest of us. "See how the screws have been loosened and arranged in a neat line along the marble. The work of someone methodical, not a common grave robber seeking valuables." He circled the casket with feline grace, his lantern held low, missing nothing. Suddenly he paused, leaning close to the bronze surface and inhaling delicately. "You note it, Hastings?" "I smell only stone and cold," I confessed. "And a whisper of lily of the valley where no blossom should grow," he replied. His eyebrows rose with interest. "The same scent that perfumed our dinner invitations and Lord Ashworth's final letter." Graves stepped forward, his composure cracking slightly. His lordship was buried with his signet ring, as he always wished. Left hand, third finger, the crest facing outward as he wore it in life. Ah, précisément, Poirot murmured, studying the narrow gap beneath the casket lid. The lid lifted only enough to pass a hand within. If one wished to remove a ring, or perhaps to replace it, this would suffice. He indicated tiny flecks caught in the bronze fittings. You see, Hastings, these minute grains that gleam faintly, blue-black like midnight. I peered until my eyes ached. There, caught in the metal's imperfections, were microscopic fragments that gleamed dully in our lamplight. Wax, Poirot said softly. Blue-black wax, such as sealed our invitations and the letter in the study. It adheres to warmth, to oil, to the tiny imperfections of a metal surface. A signet ring used upon fresh wax, handled swiftly, would carry such traces. When returned in haste, what clings remains, as evidence. The false trail. As we prepared to leave the mausoleum, Constable Morrison's sharp eyes caught something glinting near the entrance. "Here now," he said, kneeling to examine a small object half buried in the disturbed earth. "What's this, then?" With his handkerchief, he lifted a tarnished silver locket, its surface muddy but recognizable. Lady Ashworth gasped. "That's Violet's, her mother's locket. Pemberton had it placed in the mausoleum with her, mother's memorial tablet. It was a sentimental piece." All eyes turned to Miss Violet Ashworth, whose face had gone pale in the lamplight. "My locket? But why would anyone take that? And why would they drop it here?" "Small footprints leading away from the mausoleum," Morrison observed, his lantern illuminating the disturbed earth. "Not a man's boot by the looks of it, and the locket was found open, contents intact, but clearly handled recently." The implication hung in the cold air like an accusation. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Ashworth, you did mention taking a walk in the grounds this evening to clear your head. This is preposterous," Miss Violet exclaimed, finding her voice. "I would never desecrate my own mother's resting place." Poirot, who had been observing this exchange with his usual detached intensity, now held up a hand. "One moment, mes amis. While the evidence appears compelling on the surface, I find myself with certain reservations." He examined the locket with his magnifying glass, turning it over in his palm with characteristic precision. "This locket, Miss Ashworth, the clasp is rather stiff, is it not? Not easily opened with a casual touch." "It's very old," she confirmed, her voice trembling. "I rarely opened it myself." "Precisely," Poirot said, a faint smile playing on his lips, "and yet it was found open, its contents undisturbed, but clearly examined. Consider this, mes amis. If Miss Ashworth were indeed the person who broke into the mausoleum, would she not ensure that such an incriminating object was properly secured or disposed of? To drop it open by the very entrance seems an act of astonishing carelessness for someone attempting to evade detection." He paused, letting his words sink in. Furthermore, the letter Miss Ashworth received spoke of trustees acting without fear. If she sought to influence the will, one might expect her to be seeking documents or evidence, not disturbing a sentimental locket with no legal significance. The true purpose. Revealed. Poirot returned the locket to the constable with deliberate care. "I suggest, Constable, that this locket was not dropped by our intruder, but deliberately placed to divert suspicion. The little grey cells, they tell me this clue is too convenient, too perfectly positioned. It is designed to mislead, not to reveal." He turned back to the casket, his expression grave. No, the true purpose of this violation was far more specific. Someone needed Lord Ashworth's signet ring to authenticate forged documents. Our dinner invitations, the letters found in his study, perhaps others we have not yet discovered. They took the ring, used it to create their deceptions, and then returned it to avoid the scandal of a missing burial artifact. Lady Ashworth found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. You're saying someone has been impersonating my husband, using his ring, to forge his seal. Indeed, madam. The psychology is most revealing. We are dealing with someone who needed the authority of Lord Ashworth's name and seal, but who also possessed enough conscience or fear to return the stolen ring rather than keep it. This suggests someone close to the family, someone who would be devastated by the discovery of such sacrilege. As we made our way back through the fog-shrouded grounds, the implications of Poirot's deductions settled over our small party like a suffocating blanket. Someone among us had violated the sanctity of the grave to continue their deception. Someone who moved through Ashworth Hall with the familiarity of a family member or trusted servant. The web tightens. Back in the warmth of the drawing room, Poirot arranged the evening's evidence on the mahogany side table with his characteristic precision. The forged invitations, the mysterious letters, now connected by microscopic traces of wax to a violation of the dead. The false trail of the planted locket had been exposed, but the true perpetrator remained hidden among us. The phantom who invited us to dinner, Poirot said, removing his gloves with delicate care, was raised not by spirits, but by a living hand that now trembles with fear. Someone in this room has played the part of a ghost, using the authority of the dead to serve the purposes of the living. He glanced at the assembled faces, tired, strained, and now, for the first time, truly wary of his penetrating gaze. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and somewhere among the flickering shadows cast by the dying fire, a murderer was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had started to unravel their carefully constructed web of deception. The fog pressed against the tall windows like ghostly fingers, and in the distance, the grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary days in our experience and the beginning of what promised to be an even more revealing dawn. The witching hour had settled over Ashworth Hall like a shroud, yet sleep remained elusive for every soul within its ancient walls. The drawing room had taken on an almost confessional atmosphere, with Poirot positioned in his wing-back chair like a benevolent inquisitor, the dying firelight casting shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of unspoken secrets. The evidence of the evening's revelations lay arranged before him with mathematical precision. The forged invitations, the mysterious letters, the violated grave, each piece waiting to find its place in the larger tapestry of deception, the methodical unraveling. The hour grows late, Poirot observed, consulting his pocket watch with characteristic precision. Yet I suspect that truth, like dawn, comes only after the darkest moments of night. With your permission, I should like to speak with each of you individually. The psychology of our situation requires careful examination, and sometimes the most revealing truths emerge in quiet conversation rather than public discourse. He gestured toward the morning room, whose door stood ajar, allowing the warm light to spill into the corridor like an invitation to confession. Captain Hastings will remain present as witness, naturellement. The forthright nature that Lord Ashworth so valued in his invitation will serve us well. Graves entered first, his dignity intact despite the extraordinary circumstances, though I noticed the deeper lines around his mouth spoke of strain that even his professional composure could not entirely conceal. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of butlerly propriety, yet something in his bearing suggested a man carrying an unwelcome burden. Graves, Poirot began with gentle authority. This evening you have followed instructions you believed to be from your late master. You burned a note, set a place at table, delivered sealed envelopes. Tell me, how precisely did these instructions reach you? In his lordship's study, sir, Graves replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. This morning at 9 o'clock, as I performed my customary dusting, I observed the cabinet key resting upon the leather blotter with a card beside it, written in his lordship's distinctive hand. The instructions were quite specific. Set the table for 8. Deliver the sealed envelopes with the fish course. Burn this note after reading. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest, and the key was not in its usual place within the bronze St. George. No, sir, most unusual. His lordship was exceedingly particular about such matters. The disruption of his established order would have distressed him greatly. Graves paused, his professional mask slipping slightly. I've served this family for 32 years, Monsieur Poirot. Lord Ashworth prized punctuality and absolute obedience above all virtues. Even from beyond the grave, it seemed his will continued to direct the household. The lily of the valley scent, Poirot continued. You are familiar with it? Indeed, sir. There is a bottle in his lordship's dressing room, a special blend from Jermyn Street. This morning I found it had been moved from its customary position on the marble washstand. I replaced it naturally, though I confess the displacement troubled me. Poirot leaned forward with sudden interest. Who, besides yourself, had reason to enter Lord Ashworth's dressing room since his passing? Lady Ashworth, certainly, though she has avoided those rooms since the funeral. Mrs. Fairchild occasionally, when retrieving items for correspondence. The family members, of course, though they rarely ventured into his private quarters. Graves hesitated, then added, Dr. Hartwell inquired about access yesterday, something regarding personal effects that might aid in understanding his lordship's final illness. The medical interrogation. When Dr. Hartwell entered the morning room, his usual kindly demeanor had been replaced by the defensive posture of a man under siege. His medical bag remained clutched in his lap like a shield, and his hands trembled slightly as he arranged his spectacles. Doctor, Poirot began, his tone gentle yet penetrating. Your note from Lord Ashworth read, the dose must be correct. A peculiar phrase for a medical man. Would you not agree? Dr. Hartwell's face flushed, and he removed his spectacles to polish them with unnecessary vigor. Medical men speak constantly of dosages, Monsieur Poirot. It could refer to any number of treatments or prescriptions. Pemberton was a difficult patient, prone to questioning every remedy I prescribed. Indeed, yet Lord Ashworth's letter to us all mentioned violent illness following his evening brandy on the 2nd of November. In your professional opinion, could such symptoms indicate something more sinister than indigestion? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Dr. Hartwell's hands stilled, and for a moment the only sound was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Certain alkaloids, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, if administered in small doses over time, could produce such symptoms. Nausea, digestive distress, gradual weakening of the constitution, but the timing would need to be precise, the dosage carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. The dose must be correct, Poirot repeated softly. Most illuminating. Tell me, doctor, when you advised the removal of the brandy decanter, who was informed of this medical decision? The household staff, naturally. Lady Ashworth. I believe I mentioned it to Whitfield during one of our discussions about Pemberton's declining health. Dr. Hartwell's voice carried a defensive edge. I thought strong spirits inadvisable given his digestive complaints. Yet the decanter reappeared the following day. Did this not concern you professionally? Charles replaced it against my medical advice. I told him he was being reckless, but the boy was determined to indulge his father's habits. The doctor's hands moved to his gloves, and I noticed Poirot's sharp eyes following the gesture. Doctor, if you would be so kind as to remove your right glove. Dr. Hartwell's face went pale. I beg your pardon. Your right glove, s'il vous plaît. I detect a faint sweetness upon the leather. Lily of the valley, unless I am much mistaken. With obvious reluctance, Dr. Hartwell stripped off the glove. The fingertips bore the unmistakable stain of blue-black ink, and the scent of Lord Ashworth's cologne was immediately apparent. I handled one of those infernal perfumed letters this evening, Dr. Hartwell said quickly. In the hall, before you called me for questioning. If you imply, I imply nothing, mon ami. I merely observe. Poirot's voice carried that dangerous gentleness I had learned to recognize. But I find it curious that a man who claims to detest the scent of lily of the valley should carry it so prominently upon his person. The psychological web. The remaining interviews followed with methodical precision. James Whitfield revealed his desperation regarding the business ventures that would collapse without Lord Ashworth's continued investment. Miss Violet's composure cracked slightly when discussing the Temple Foundation, revealing her fear that the family's legacy would be dispersed among strangers. Lady Ashworth's careful dignity masked deeper currents of resentment regarding her husband's increasingly autocratic control over household affairs. Each conversation revealed another strand in the web of motives. Each personal note from the deceased had struck precisely at the heart of individual fears and guilts. The murderer had not chosen their psychological weapons randomly. They had crafted each message with surgical precision, knowing exactly which vulnerabilities to exploit. "The pattern emerges," Poirot said when the last interview had concluded. "We are dealing with someone who possessed intimate knowledge of every person in this household, their fears, their secrets, their precise psychological pressure points. This was not the work of an outsider, mes amis, but of someone who had observed and catalogued human weakness with the patience of a natural historian. The trap is set." As the clock chimed 2 in the morning, Poirot made his final preparations. He arranged the evidence on the morning room table with characteristic precision, then moved to the mantelpiece where the bronze St. George stood sentinel. "Observe, Hastings," he said, deliberately tilting the figure so that it sat askew upon its marble base. A small disorder in a household that prized perfect arrangement above all things. To most, it would be invisible. To one particular mind, it will be unbearable. "You expect our murderer to return?" "I expect compulsion to prove stronger than prudence," Poirot replied, settling into his chair with the patience of a spider waiting in its web. "The little grey cells, they tell me that a mind capable of such elaborate deception cannot tolerate even the smallest disruption to their carefully orchestrated design. They will come, mon ami. They must come." The house settled around us with the whispered conversations of ancient timbers, while fog pressed against the tall windows like ghostly fingers seeking entry. Somewhere in the darkness, a floorboard creaked with the weight of footsteps that should not exist, and I realized that the most dangerous part of our evening was yet to come. The psychological trap had been set with all of Poirot's characteristic precision. Now we could only wait to see which of our suspects would prove unable to resist the compulsion to restore perfect order to a world they had worked so hard to control. The vigil that followed tested every nerve in my body. We had positioned ourselves in the darkened library, adjacent to the morning room, where heavy velvet curtains allowed us to observe the corridor through a narrow gap while remaining concealed in shadow. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing quarter hour with sepulchral authority, its deep voice seeming to resonate through the very bones of Ashworth Hall like the heartbeat of some ancient, slumbering beast. Poirot sat with the stillness of a marble statue, his green eyes fixed upon the deliberately displaced bronze St. George, with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. His breathing was so controlled, so utterly silent, that I found myself checking periodically to ensure he remained conscious. This was Poirot in his element, the psychological hunter waiting for his quarry to reveal itself through the very compulsions that had driven them to deception. The compulsions revealed. At 23 minutes past 2, our patience was first rewarded. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the main corridor, moving with the practiced economy of someone who knew every creaking board and potential obstacle in the ancient house. Graves appeared, his shuttered lantern casting the narrowest slit of light as he moved with the silent precision that marked 32 years of service. His eyes went immediately to the mantelpiece, and I observed that minute tightening of the mouth that betrayed what his hands did next. 2 swift, precise movements that restored the bronze St. George to perfect alignment upon its marble base. He drew a breath that was almost a sigh of relief, surveyed the room with the methodical attention of a man ensuring all was in proper order, then withdrew as silently as he had entered. The housekeeper's instinct in a butler's soul, Poirot murmured when Graves had disappeared. He serves order, but he does not command it. No, we wait for the true architect of disorder. 20 minutes later, a second figure approached, Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, moving with the careful precision of someone whose entire existence had been devoted to maintaining another's perfect world. She carried a candle cupped in her palm, its flickering light revealing the silver hair and keen eyes that had read 30 years of Lord Ashworth's correspondence. She did not look at the mantelpiece immediately. Instead, she went straight to the desk, her hands moving with ritualistic reverence as she squared the leather blotter with the precision of a priest arranging altar cloths. From her sleeve appeared a slender steel bodkin, a secretary's tool for lifting papers without marking them, which she used to adjust the upper sheet by the merest fraction before smoothing it with the flat of her palm. It was only then that her attention turned to the displaced bronze figure, and I saw her face contort with genuine distress at the sight of the imperfection. Her hands trembled as she restored it to its proper position, her movements speaking of deep psychological necessity rather than mere tidiness. Poirot's gentle cough announced our presence, causing the elderly secretary to start as though the desk had delivered an electric shock. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, rising with courteous grace, "forgive our intrusion. We are but observers in a room that seems to call to its faithful servants, even in the darkest hour." I could not sleep," she whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany surface. 30 years of habit are not easily broken. I have never retired for the night, leaving his lordship's study in disorder. "The devotion of a lifetime," Poirot observed gently. "Yet I notice you carry the tools of your trade even in your night clothes. The bodkin, most useful for examining papers without leaving traces, no?" Her eyes flickered to the steel instrument in her hand, then back to Poirot's penetrating gaze. "Old habits, Monsieur Poirot. A secretary learns to handle documents with care." "Indeed. And the faint scent of lily of the valley upon your hands. Also a habit from your years of service." Mrs. Fairchild's composure wavered for just a moment. "I arranged some of his lordship's personal effects yesterday. The cologne, it brings back memories of better times." She adjusted 2 pens by degrees that would have been invisible to any other eye, then departed with her candle, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The medical compulsion. Our third visitor arrived within the hour. Dr. Hartwell, moving with the guilty determination of a man driven by forces beyond his conscious control. He carried a dark bottle in his hand and went directly to the brandy decanter on the side table, holding his bottle at arm's length as though comparing colors in the dim firelight. "Doctor," Poirot said conversationally, "the hour grows late for medical consultations." Hartwell started, recovered, and managed what he clearly hoped was a reassuring smile. "Forgive me, Monsieur Poirot. I thought it best to remove temptation. The brandy. It has caused enough trouble in this house." He set his bottle down with obvious reluctance, and I noticed a faint clouding at its neck, some residue that would be unremarkable unless one was specifically looking for such things. Poirot naturally was. "Temptation indeed," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Of the palate, of the conscience, of the professional oath to do no harm." Dr. Hartwell's gaze flitted nervously to the desk and away again. "I hope you will not keep Lady Ashworth awake much longer. Her nerves have been severely tested by these extraordinary circumstances." He departed before either of us could respond, leaving behind only the lingering scent of guilt and the faint medicinal odor from his mysterious bottle. The pattern emerges. When we were alone again, Poirot resumed his position with thoughtful deliberation. "You observe the pattern, mon ami. 3 visitors, each drawn by compulsion rather than conscious choice. The butler who cannot tolerate physical disorder, the secretary who cannot bear administrative imperfection, and the physician who cannot escape the consequences of his professional decisions. But which of them is our forger, I asked. Ah, that is where the psychology becomes most interesting, Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. Each possesses the skills necessary for our deception. Graves knows every corner of this house and could move freely without detection. Mrs. Fairchild has intimate knowledge of Lord Ashworth's handwriting and access to his personal effects. Dr. Hartwell understands the medical aspects of his lordship's final illness and has reason to fear exposure. He paused, studying the evidence arranged on the table with mathematical precision. But observe the psychology more closely, Hastings. The person who orchestrated this elaborate posthumous charade possesses not merely the technical skills, but the emotional compulsion to create perfect order from chaos. They cannot bear to leave loose ends, cannot tolerate imperfection in their grand design. You speak as though you know who it is. The little grey cells have formed certain hypotheses, Poirot admitted. But hypotheses require proof, and proof requires the final act of our psychological drama. Someone in this house has created a masterpiece of deception using the authority of the dead to serve the purposes of the living. But like all artists, they cannot resist the urge to perfect their creation. As if summoned by his words, a sound cut through the silence, footsteps in the corridor above, moving with purpose rather than stealth. A door opened and closed with deliberate care, and then silence returned, heavier than before. "It begins," Poirot murmured, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "The endgame approaches, mon ami, and with it, the revelation of a mind so consumed by the need for perfect justice that it has created its own elaborate court of judgment." The fog pressed against the tall windows like ghostly fingers seeking entry, while somewhere in the distance a clock chimed 4 times. Dawn was still hours away, but I could sense that the longest night in the history of Ashworth Hall was finally approaching its climax. The psychological trap had been set with characteristic precision, and now we could only wait to see which of our suspects would prove unable to resist the compulsion to complete their masterful, but ultimately flawed design. The game was indeed reaching its crucial phase, though the final moves remained to be played in the cold light of morning. The grey light of dawn crept through the tall windows of Ashworth Hall like a reluctant witness to the night's revelations, casting long shadows that seemed to retreat from the approaching truth. Poirot had maintained his vigil with the patience of a master angler, knowing that the psychological currents he had set in motion would inevitably draw his quarry into the open. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act of this elaborate posthumous drama to unfold. The compulsion revealed. At precisely 6 o'clock, as the first birds began their tentative morning chorus, our patience was rewarded. A figure descended the main staircase with movements that spoke of deep psychological compulsion rather than conscious choice. It was Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, moving with the ritualistic precision of someone whose entire existence had been devoted to maintaining another's perfect world. She carried a small leather portfolio and moved directly to the study, her actions betraying the kind of systematic thoroughness that had made her indispensable to Lord Ashworth for 30 years. Through the partially open door, we observed her examining the desk with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts, her trained eye cataloguing every detail with professional precision. But it was her next action that confirmed Poirot's most significant deduction. From the portfolio, she withdrew a sheet of the familiar cream paper and began to write with the practiced skill of someone who had observed Lord Ashworth's handwriting for 3 decades. The forgery was masterful, every stroke, every flourish reproduced with the accuracy of a master craftsman who had studied her subject with devotional intensity. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of confirmed hypothesis. The final piece of correspondence, prepared with the same meticulous care as all the others. She cannot leave her masterpiece incomplete. The second incident. As Mrs. Fairchild sealed her letter with blue-black wax, pressing what could only be Lord Ashworth's signet ring into the molten surface, a sound from the corridor above froze us all in place. Heavy footsteps, unsteady but determined, were descending toward the study. James Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his face haggard with sleepless anxiety and his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "I received another note," he said, his voice carrying the strain of a man pushed beyond endurance. "Slipped under my door an hour ago. The same paper, the same seal, demanding that I present myself here at dawn to settle accounts in full." Mrs. Fairchild had frozen at her task, the freshly sealed letter still in her hands, caught in the act of her elaborate deception. The psychological trap that Poirot had suspected was now revealed in all its calculated precision. She had been orchestrating not just the evening's events, but a systematic campaign of psychological pressure designed to extract confessions from those she deemed guilty. "Mr. Whitfield," Poirot said, stepping into the study with characteristic authority, "I suggest you do not touch anything in this room. Mrs. Fairchild, if you would be so kind as to place that letter upon the desk and step away from the evidence." The elderly secretary's composure cracked for the first time since we had known her. 30 years, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated loyalty and betrayal. 30 years of faithful service, and I watched them destroy him piece by piece. The physical evidence speaks. Poirot moved to the desk with the precision of a surgeon, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped our earlier observations. The leather blotter bore not just the impressions of recent writing, but a pattern of minute indentations that spoke of systematic document preparation over several days. "Observe, Hastings," he said, tilting the blotter to catch the morning light. "Here, the ghost impression of fish course, the instruction for Graves regarding the delivery of personal messages. Here, 9 o'clock precisely, the timing for our discovery of the cabinet letter. And here, most illuminating of all, the practice strokes where our forger perfected the particular flourish of Lord Ashworth's signature." He lifted the fresh letter with delicate care, examining the wax seal with his characteristic thoroughness. Blue-black wax, applied while warm, bearing microscopic traces of lily of the Valley cologne. The same cologne that scented our dinner invitations, the same that perfumed the violated casket in the mausoleum. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced a small magnifying glass and studied the signet ring that Mrs. Fairchild had been forced to abandon on the desk. "And here, mes amis, we have the final confirmation. Tiny fragments of wax embedded in the ring's intricate carvings, evidence of multiple uses in recent days, despite its owner having been dead for a week. The psychology of justice." Mrs. Fairchild stood with the dignity of someone whose life's work had finally been exposed, her hands folded with the composure of a woman who had long anticipated this moment. "He was being murdered," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Slowly, systematically, by someone he trusted. I could not let his death go unavenged. And so you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner," Poirot observed, though his tone carried understanding rather than condemnation. "You used your intimate knowledge of Lord Ashworth's habits, his handwriting, his psychological methods, to create an elaborate, posthumous investigation designed to extract the truth from those you suspected." James Whitfield, who had been listening to this exchange with growing comprehension, sank into a chair as the full implications became clear. "The business accounts," he said hoarsely. "You've been examining the business accounts, haven't you? Looking for evidence of embezzlement, of motives for murder." "Indeed," Mrs. Fairchild replied, her professional pride evident despite the circumstances. "Lord Ashworth had begun to suspect irregularities in the financial arrangements. He had asked me to prepare a comprehensive audit, but his death intervened before the investigation could be completed. The web tightens." Poirot arranged the evidence on the desk with mathematical precision. The forged letters, the authentic ring, the practice sheets hidden beneath the blotter. Each piece spoke of a mind driven by loyalty and a sense of justice that had transcended the boundaries of conventional morality. "The psychology is most revealing," he observed, his eyes moving from Mrs. Fairchild to Whitfield and back again. "We are dealing with someone who possessed not merely the technical skills for forgery, but the emotional compulsion to create perfect justice from imperfect circumstances. Someone who knew Lord Ashworth's mind so intimately that she could channel his very essence onto paper." He paused, studying the fresh letter that had been interrupted in its creation. But the question remains, was this elaborate posthumous tribunal justified? Was Lord Ashworth indeed murdered, or was Mrs. Fairchild's devotion so complete that she created a crime where none existed? The morning light had grown stronger, painting the study in shades of gold and amber that seemed to illuminate not just the physical evidence, but the psychological landscape of loyalty, betrayal, and justice that had driven the night's extraordinary events. The trap had been sprung, the forger revealed, but the ultimate truth of Lord Ashworth's death remained tantalizingly just beyond our grasp. The stage set for revelation. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, other members of the household began to appear. Lady Ashworth, drawn by the voices. Dr. Hartwell, his medical bag clutched defensively. Miss Violet, her composure intact despite the early hour. Each face reflected the strain of the long night and the growing realization that the game was approaching its climax. "I believe," Poirot said, consulting his pocket watch with characteristic precision, "that the time has come for a final gathering. Mrs. Fairchild's elaborate posthumous investigation has served its purpose. It has brought us to the threshold of truth. Now we must step across that threshold and confront what lies beyond." The fog was finally lifting from the grounds of Ashworth Hall, and with it, the last veils of deception that had shrouded the truth. The psychological drama that had begun with impossible dinner invitations was approaching its inevitable conclusion, where the living would finally be forced to account for their actions in the unforgiving light of dawn. The little grey cells had done their work, sorting truth from deception, reality from theatrical illusion. All that remained was the final gathering, where Hercule Poirot would lay bare the complete truth of Lord Pemberton Ashworth's death, and the extraordinary lengths to which loyalty and justice could drive the human heart. The pale morning light streaming through the tall windows of Ashworth Hall's drawing-room seemed to strip away the Gothic shadows that had dominated our midnight vigil, yet the atmosphere remained charged with the electricity of impending revelation. Poirot had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle, each position calculated to allow him clear observation of every face while maintaining the theatrical gravity that such moments demanded. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild sat with the resigned dignity of someone whose life's greatest secret had been exposed, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of a woman who had long anticipated this reckoning. The evidence of her elaborate deception lay arranged on the mahogany table before her. The forged letters, the stolen signet ring, the practice sheets that revealed the painstaking care with which she had channeled her deceased master's voice from beyond the grave. The architect of posthumous justice. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of courtesy and command that always compelled attention. "We have been participants in a drama conducted by two hands, the hand of a dead man, and the hand of a living woman who could not bear to leave his affairs unfinished. Mrs. Fairchild has confessed by her actions, if not in so many words. She forged, she sealed, she scented. She took from the silent company of the dead the ring that would persuade the living." Mrs. Fairchild lifted her chin with quiet pride. 30 years of devoted service taught me to read his mind as clearly as his handwriting. I knew exactly how he would approach such a problem, methodically, precisely, with psychological pressure applied at the most vulnerable points. "Indeed," Poirot continued, his green eyes moving across the assembled faces, "the dinner invitations, each perfectly crafted to compel attendance through curiosity and guilt, the personal messages, designed to strike at the heart of individual fears and secrets. Even the violation of the mausoleum, carefully staged to provide the authentic seal necessary for your deceptions. But most brilliant of all was your understanding that the guilty party would eventually reveal themselves through their own psychological compulsions. He paused, studying each face with the intensity of a portrait painter capturing essential character. But we must separate the author of the performance from the author of the crime. Mrs. Fairchild's devotion overstepped its proper boundaries and sought justice through theatre, but her motive was not malice. It was the desperate action of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that her beloved master had been murdered. The systematic elimination. Poirot moved with characteristic precision to the mantelpiece, where the bronze St. George stood in perfect alignment. First, let us eliminate those whose guilt lies in weakness rather than malice. Graves, your compulsion to maintain perfect order, your 32 years of faithful service, these speak to your nature. A poisoning campaign requires not the maintenance of order, but the exploitation of habit, an audacity that lives outside the rule-book you have kept for decades. The butler bowed slightly, relief flickering across his dignified features. Lady Ashworth, Poirot continued with a delicate bow, your note read, "The house must be set in order." You resented your husband's autocracy, feared the dispersal of the family's legacy. Yet you did not seek to destroy the symbol of that order, his rituals, his cologne, the precise arrangement of his little world. That respect for the form, even when it made you tremble, speaks to your nature. Charles Ashworth, you restored the brandy to your father when the doctor had removed it. You did so in defiance, not in calculation. You wanted your father to think of you as indulgent, not as dutiful. Young men so often confuse love with permissiveness. But to titrate a poison across days and weeks, that requires a patience and calculation foreign to your temperament. Miss Violet's composure remained intact as Poirot's gaze fell upon her. Miss Ashworth, the planted locket was not your doing, too crude for someone of your intelligence. Your concern for the temple foundation was genuine, your love for your uncle sincere. And James Whitfield, Poirot said, his voice carrying a note of sympathy. Your financial concerns were real, your fear of the audit justified, but embezzlement, while serious, does not necessarily lead to murder. Your guilt lies in weakness, not in homicide. The medical revelation. Dr. Hartwell had grown increasingly pale during this systematic elimination, his hands trembling as he clutched his medical bag like a shield against accusation. Poirot's attention now focused upon him with laser-like intensity. Which brings us, mon docteur, to the heart of our mystery. Lord Ashworth did not die of natural causes, as his death certificate states. He was indeed murdered, slowly and systematically, by someone who understood exactly how to disguise their crime as medical necessity. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock across every face. Dr. Hartwell's professional composure began to crack visibly. The symptoms Lord Ashworth described in his letter, violent nausea, digestive distress, gradual weakening, these are entirely consistent with chronic poisoning by digitalis derived from the foxglove plant. Small doses, carefully administered over time, would produce exactly the cardiac symptoms that led to his apparent natural death. Poirot moved closer to the trembling physician. During our midnight vigil, you came to the study carrying a bottle, claiming you wished to remove temptation from the brandy decanter. But that bottle contained more than spirits. It bore the cloudy residue of medical preparation, the telltale signs of digitalis dissolved and redissolved. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced a small glass vial. While you were distracted by our conversation, Hastings obtained a sample. Chemical analysis will undoubtedly reveal traces of digitalis, carefully measured to provide what appeared to be therapeutic doses for a patient suffering from cardiac irregularities. The trap springs closed. Dr. Hartwell's face went white as parchment. That proves nothing. Digitalis is a common cardiac medication. Indeed it is, Poirot agreed gently. But not every physician would have the opportunity to administer it regularly to a trusting patient, disguised as routine medical care or added to the evening brandy that formed such an integral part of Lord Ashworth's daily ritual. You were his personal physician, trusted with his health, welcomed into his private study for regular consultations. Who better positioned to administer poison disguised as medicine? The psychological pressure was telling. Dr. Hartwell removed his spectacles with shaking hands, his usual kindly demeanor replaced by the defensive posture of a cornered animal. Consider the psychology, mes amis. Poirot continued relentlessly. Your note from Mrs. Fairchild read, "The dose must be correct," a phrase that would resonate powerfully with a physician who had been carefully calculating dosages, not for healing, but for harm. The lily of the valley scent on your gloves, transferred from handling Lord Ashworth's personal effects while preparing your deception. Most telling of all, your midnight visit to remove evidence from the brandy decanter, the actions of a guilty conscience, not a concerned physician. The confession. The dam of Dr. Hartwell's composure finally burst. Pemberton was destroying everything, he said suddenly, his voice cracking with long-suppressed emotion. The charitable donations, the will changes, he was throwing away millions while people who had served him faithfully were left with nothing. James Whitfield stared at his old friend in horror. Edmund, surely you didn't— Not for money. Not just for money, Dr. Hartwell replied, his professional mask dissolving entirely. For justice. Pemberton had become a tyrant, controlling everyone around him with his wealth while planning to give it all to strangers. Lady Ashworth reduced to a pittance, Charles cut off entirely, loyal servants dismissed without proper provision. It was monstrous. So you appointed yourself judge and executioner. Miss Violet's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You decided who deserved to live and die based on their financial circumstances. I gave him every opportunity to reconsider, Dr. Hartwell said desperately. The symptoms I induced were mild at first, designed to encourage reflection on mortality, to soften his heart toward those who had served him. But he only grew more suspicious, more determined to proceed with his plans. The final truth. Poirot moved to the window, where the morning sun was finally burning away the last traces of fog from the grounds. And so you increased the dosage, timing the final administration to coincide with his evening brandy on the 2nd of November. The very brandy you had medically prescribed, knowing that its replacement would provide the perfect opportunity for a lethal dose. It was meant to be peaceful, Dr. Hartwell whispered, his face buried in his hands. A quiet cardiac episode, natural and merciful. I never intended for him to suffer, never wanted him to suspect. But he did suspect. Mrs. Fairchild spoke, her voice carrying 30 years of accumulated loyalty and pain. He knew someone was poisoning him, and he tried to tell me, tried to leave evidence. That's why I had to act, why I had to create this elaborate investigation. His voice had been silenced, but his justice could still be served. Poirot's reflection. As Constable Morrison was summoned to take Dr. Hartwell into custody, Poirot surveyed the assembled company with that mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that marked the conclusion of his most complex cases. The psychology is most revealing, he observed quietly. We have witnessed not one crime, but two. The murder committed by Dr. Hartwell, in the elaborate posthumous investigation orchestrated by Mrs. Fairchild. Both sprang from the same source, absolute certainty in the righteousness of their cause. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room like dust after a great disturbance. Dr. Hartwell believed he was correcting an injustice, protecting those he felt deserved Lord Ashworth's generosity. Mrs. Fairchild believed she was serving justice by exposing her master's murderer. Both were driven by loyalty, by love, by the conviction that their actions served a higher moral purpose. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Ashworth Hall, illuminating not just the physical evidence of crime and deception, but the complex moral landscape where justice and vengeance, loyalty and betrayal intersected in ways that defied simple judgment. The psychological drama that had begun with impossible dinner invitations had reached its inevitable conclusion, where the living were finally forced to account for their actions in the unforgiving light of absolute truth. The little grey cells had done their work, sorting truth from elaborate fiction, revealing the human heart in all its complexity, capable of both profound devotion and terrible betrayal, sometimes within the same action. The arrest of Dr. Edmund Hartwell possessed an almost ceremonial quietude that seemed fitting for the conclusion of such an elaborate posthumous drama. Constable Morrison, reinforced by 2 constables from the village and bearing the reluctant authority of a magistrate roused from his morning tea, conducted the proceedings with a gentleness that spoke more to the tragedy of a respected man's fall than to the triumph of justice served. Dr. Hartwell offered no resistance, requesting only his medical bag with the pathetic dignity of someone clinging to the last vestiges of professional identity. The emotional reckoning. The drawing-room of Ashworth Hall seemed to exhale as the door closed behind the departing figures, releasing the tension that had gripped the ancient house throughout the long night's revelations. Lady Ashworth sat with the rigid composure of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered, not merely by her husband's murder, but by the realization that their trusted family physician had been the instrument of that betrayal. 37 years of medical practice, she said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow tone of profound disillusionment. We trusted you with our children's fevers, our family's most intimate health concerns. How could you pervert that sacred trust into an instrument of murder? Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, who had orchestrated the night's elaborate investigation with the precision of a master playwright, now stood with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life's greatest mission had been accomplished. The evidence of her deception lay scattered across the mahogany table, the forged letters, the stolen signet ring, the practice sheets. Yet her expression held no shame, only the weary relief of a burden finally lifted. He suspected, you know, she said, addressing the assembled company with the authority of 30 years' intimate knowledge. Lord Ashworth knew someone was poisoning him. He tried to tell me, tried to leave evidence. That's why I had to act, why I had to create this elaborate investigation. His voice had been silenced, but his justice could still be served. The practical aftermath. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of fog from the Surrey countryside, the practical necessities of resolution began to assert themselves. Mr. Hargreaves, Lord Ashworth's solicitor, arrived by the midday train, a brisk gentleman whose professional composure masked a deep respect for the complexities of human nature that his practice had revealed. From his leather satchel, he produced a sealed codicil executed on the very morning of November 2nd, the day Dr. Hartwell had administered his final, fatal dose. The irony was not lost on any of us that the victim's last legal act had unknowingly sealed his murderer's fate by providing a clear motive for the accelerated timeline of the crime. The codicil stands, Hargreaves announced with quiet authority. The Temple Foundation is confirmed as trustee of the Antiquities Collection, but with provisions that Lord Ashworth added upon Mrs. Fairchild's recommendation. Miss Violet will serve as the family's representative on the board, and a wing will be endowed in Lady Ashworth's name. The household staff, I was pleased to learn, had been remembered with careful legacies, a fact that cast Dr. Hartwell's self-appointed justice in an even crueler light. James Whitfield, whose financial irregularities now seemed almost quaint compared to the enormity of murder, accepted the inevitability of a thorough audit with the dignity of a man determined to make amends. There will be restitution, he told Lady Ashworth with simple sincerity. I allowed fear to make me dishonest. That ends today. Poirot's final analysis. As the practical matters were being resolved, Poirot positioned himself by the tall windows where the morning light revealed the Gothic grandeur of Ashworth Hall in all its ancient dignity. His green eyes held that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that marked the conclusion of his most psychologically complex cases. "The psychology of this affair will remain with me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical reflection. "We have witnessed the collision of two absolute certainties: Dr. Hartwell's conviction that he was serving justice by eliminating a tyrant, and Mrs. Fairchild's equally powerful belief that her master's death demanded investigation and retribution." He paused, studying the evidence that still lay arranged with mathematical precision on the mahogany table. Both were right in their fashion, and both were catastrophically wrong. Dr. Hartwell correctly identified Lord Ashworth's tyrannical tendencies, but chose murder over patience or proper intervention. Mrs. Fairchild correctly suspected foul play, but chose elaborate deception over conventional legal channels. Miss Violet, whose steadiness throughout the ordeal had impressed us all, spoke with thoughtful precision. "What troubles me most is the certainty with which both acted. Neither doubted the righteousness of their cause, yet they reached completely opposite conclusions about how justice should be served." "Précisément, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, his eyes reflecting the philosophical complexity that had made this case so remarkable. "The human heart is capable of justifying almost any action when convinced of its moral necessity. Between usefulness and faithfulness, between order and truth, lies the narrow bridge on which justice must balance." The question of Mrs. Fairchild. Constable Morrison, who had been taking notes with the methodical thoroughness of a village policeman confronting his first major criminal case, raised the delicate question of Mrs. Fairchild's fate. "Technically speaking, she's committed forgery, theft, and desecration of a grave." Lady Ashworth rose with sudden determination, her grief transformed into fierce protectiveness. "Mrs. Fairchild will face no charges if I have anything to say about it. She served my husband faithfully for 30 years, and her actions, however misguided, were motivated by devotion to his memory and a desire to see justice done." Poirot nodded approvingly. "The law, mon ami, is a blunt instrument designed to address common crimes committed for common motives. Mrs. Fairchild's actions, while technically criminal, were driven by loyalty and a desire for justice that transcends ordinary understanding. Sometimes one must endure a very small disorder to prevent a very great one." The departure. As our involvement in the extraordinary affairs of Ashworth Hall drew to its close, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable chain of events that had begun with an impossible dinner invitation from a dead man and ended with the exposure of murder disguised as medical care. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the ancient estate in all its Gothic splendor, yet somehow the house seemed less imposing in the clear morning light, as though truth had diminished its capacity to harbor secrets. Charles Ashworth, who had sought out Poirot privately before our departure, emerged from their conversation with something approaching hope in his bearing. "A position with the Temple Foundation," Poirot explained to me later, under Miss Violet's guidance. "The allowance will be tied to performance, severe enough to form character, flexible enough to leave room for redemption." On the steps of Ashworth Hall, Lady Ashworth pressed Poirot's hand with genuine gratitude. "You have returned order to our lives, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's smile was grave but kind. "Madame, I have uncovered truth. Order, that is a more delicate matter, requiring the patient work of time and the healing grace of understanding." The journey home. The drive back to London through the Surrey countryside, with hedgerows running gold in the afternoon sun, provided an opportunity for final reflection on one of the most psychologically complex cases of Poirot's distinguished career. The ancient landscape rolled past our windows, unchanged by the human drama that had played out within Ashworth Hall's Gothic walls. "You were very certain of Dr. Hartwell," I ventured as we approached the outskirts of London. Was there any single clue that convinced you of his guilt? Poirot considered the question with characteristic precision. A single clue? Non, mon ami. A single mind, yes. The murderer was a physician with a conscience that wished to do wrong by a method that resembled right. He chose the dose, the ritual, the consultation, the brandy, each a mask for murder. Only psychology could unmask such a one. He settled more comfortably in the leather seat, immaculate as ever, despite a night without sleep. But I confess there was one small amusement for me in this case. The signet ring of Lord Ashworth, used to seal the invitation that brought Hercule Poirot to dinner, has now, in its way, sealed the fate of the man who killed him. Life, it has sometimes a flair for symmetry that even I must admire. Final reflections. As we reached our familiar flat in London, Poirot paused at the threshold to adjust a picture frame by the breadth of a hair, regarding his work with quiet satisfaction. The small ritual, so characteristic of his nature, seemed to restore the proper order to his world after the elaborate disorder we had witnessed. "You see, Hastings," he said, his eyes twinkling with that impish light that was so endearing, "so little is required to put a world to rights." "So little, and so much," I replied, thinking of the complex web of human motivations we had untangled. "Just so," said Poirot, removing his gloves with delicate precision. "The little grey cells have earned their rest. Now, mon ami, let us have chocolate. The living deserve their simple pleasures, having spent so much time in the company of the dead." And so concluded the extraordinary affair of the dinner invitation signed by the dead, a case that had tested not merely Poirot's deductive abilities, but his understanding of the complex moral landscape where justice and vengeance, loyalty and betrayal intersect in ways that defy simple judgment. The murderer had been exposed, the truth revealed, but the deeper questions about human nature and the price of absolute certainty would linger long after the fog had lifted from the ancient grounds of Ashworth Hall. In the end, as Poirot had observed, we had witnessed not one crime, but two. Murder committed in the name of justice and elaborate deception orchestrated in the service of truth. Both sprang from the same source, the dangerous certainty that comes from believing oneself the sole arbiter of right and wrong. It was a lesson that would remain with us both, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who commit their crimes with the clearest consciences. The weeks that followed our return from Ashworth Hall brought with them a peculiar quality of resolution that seemed to settle over even the most routine aspects of our daily existence. The morning papers, naturally, had seized upon the story with characteristic sensationalism. "Trusted physician murders patient," screamed the headlines. Yet the coverage, for all its dramatic flourishes, failed to capture the psychological complexity that had made the case so extraordinary. The legal reckoning. Dr. Edmund Hartwell's trial, when it came, was conducted with the solemn dignity befitting a man whose fall from grace carried implications far beyond his individual guilt. His defense, mounted by one of London's most distinguished barristers, did not attempt to deny the facts, but rather to present them within a framework of misguided compassion and professional duty corrupted by personal conviction. The medical testimony proved particularly damning. Expert witnesses confirmed that the digitalis found in Lord Ashworth's system had been administered with the precision of someone intimately familiar with both the drug's properties and the victim's physical condition. The gradual increase in dosage, carefully calculated to produce symptoms consistent with natural cardiac decline, spoke to a methodical mind that had perverted medical knowledge into an instrument of murder. "The irony," Poirot observed as we read the trial reports over our morning chocolate, "is most profound. Dr. Hartwell's medical expertise, which should have made him the guardian of life, instead made him the perfect architect of death. His knowledge of Lord Ashworth's constitution, his access to the household, his understanding of how to disguise poison as medicine, All these advantages came to him through the sacred trust of the physician-patient relationship. The court ultimately accepted a plea of manslaughter rather than murder, recognizing what the judge termed moral confusion in the defendant's actions. It satisfied nobody completely, yet offended nobody beyond endurance. A peculiarly English solution to an impossible moral puzzle. The scent of truth. It was some days after the trial's conclusion that Poirot's restless intellect led us to Jermyn Street, where he pushed open the door of a discreet perfumer's shop whose air seemed composed of whispers and memory. The proprietor, recognizing Poirot with the deference accorded to a valued client, presented various small bottles for his examination. "The lily of the valley," Poirot murmured, lifting a tester no larger than a thimble. "Fresh, not cloying, with a note of white musk. The ghost of Lord Ashworth's presence, Hastings, confined in crystal." "You always maintained that scent was the most treacherous of clues," I observed. "The most faithful," he corrected with gentle precision. "Sight forgets, hearing confuses, but scent, ah, mon ami, it is a witness that returns to the scene whether invited or not. On the envelopes, on the gloves, in the study where it had no business to remain, on the violated casket where love and desperation had left their mark, the little bloom of memory that whispered, 'Someone has recreated a dead man's habits as though they were a costume for the stage.' As we walked back toward Piccadilly, I pressed him upon those final details that had continued to puzzle me. The planted locket, for instance. You were certain it was misdirection, but how could you be so sure? Poirot's shoulders executed that characteristic Belgian shrug which was at once patient and indulgent. "Consider the psychology, mon ami. The locket was found open, its contents examined but undisturbed. Miss Violet would never have opened such a treasured memento carelessly, and Mrs. Fairchild's touch was too delicate to damage what she loved. But observe, I found the faintest smear inside the rim, a whisper of medical tincture rather than cosmetic powder. Dr. Hartwell had been preparing his little bottles that night. His fingers betrayed him where his conscience could not. The redemption of loyalty. True to Lady Ashworth's word, no charges were brought against Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild for her elaborate posthumous investigation. More significantly, her intimate knowledge of Lord Ashworth's affairs made her invaluable to the Temple Foundation's work. A letter arrived in December, written in her precise secretarial hand, but bearing the warmer tone of someone who had found unexpected peace. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, the Foundation's work proceeds with gratifying efficiency. Miss Violet has proven herself a capable administrator, combining her uncle's attention to detail with a more flexible approach to human nature. The collection now serves scholars from across Europe, and I confess to considerable satisfaction in seeing Lord Ashworth's vision realized in ways that honor both his intellectual passion and his family's devotion. Perhaps the most valuable lesson of our extraordinary evening is that truth, like justice, requires patience and humility rather than the absolute certainty that drove both the murderer and his unlikely nemesis. We have learned to question our own convictions as rigorously as we examine those of others. I remain, with deepest gratitude, Eleanor Fairchild. The Return of the Ring. A few days later, a small package arrived, hand-carried by a footman whose livery outshone his years. Inside lay Lord Ashworth's signet ring, wrapped in tissue paper, accompanied by a note in Miss Violet's neat hand. We thought it better that the symbol of Uncle's authority should begin its second life in honesty. We have sealed the Foundation's deeds with it. It now returns to safekeeping, where, to borrow Mrs. Fairchild's phrase, it can do no further mischief. Poirot held the ring against the lamplight, admiring not its heraldic crest, but the fine scratches where blue-black wax had once lodged in its intricate carvings. "It is a thing like any other," he mused. "A seal says only, 'I intend,' It cannot say, "I am right." The philosophy of certainty. As winter settled over London, bringing with it the familiar rhythms that made our flat a haven of warmth and order, Poirot's reflections on the case took on a deeper philosophical dimension. The bronze St. George figurine, a replica of the one that had played such a crucial role in our investigation, occupied a place of honor on his desk, adjusted daily to perfect alignment. The psychology of absolute certainty. "Hastings," he said one evening as we sat before the fire, "is perhaps the most dangerous quality the human mind can possess." Dr. Hartwell was certain that Lord Ashworth deserved to die. Mrs. Fairchild was certain that elaborate deception was the only path to justice. Both acted with complete conviction in the righteousness of their cause, yet both chose methods that violated the very principles they claimed to defend. He paused, his green eyes reflecting the firelight with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. The heart that is certain is the heart that must be questioned most carefully. The brain that doubts, that one proves a safer companion at any dinner table, whether the host be living or dead. Final reflections. The Ashworth Hall case had officially closed with Dr. Hartwell's conviction and subsequent death in prison, not from violence or despair, but from the same cardiac condition he had induced in his victim. Yet its psychological implications continued to unfold like ripples in a pond, touching aspects of human nature that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Lord Ashworth's murder. "Remember this case, mon ami," Poirot said as he made his final adjustments to the evening's correspondence, each sheet aligned with mathematical precision. "Remember how conviction without humility, loyalty without wisdom, and justice without mercy can transform the noblest impulses into instruments of destruction. We have had a dinner invitation from the dead and learned that the most dangerous criminals are often those who commit their crimes with the clearest consciences." Outside, London resumed its eternal appointment with commerce and conversation. Inside, a picture frame stood perfectly straight, a paper knife lay exactly parallel to a ledger's edge, and my friend's little grey cells, having danced all night with ghosts and unraveled the most complex of human motivations, finally sat down to rest. "The next time a dead man invites us to dine," I said with a laugh, "perhaps we should decline." "Certainement non," Poirot replied with mock outrage. "Hercule Poirot never refuses a dinner to which the mind is invited. But I confess, mon ami, I do prefer that the host be capable of carving the roast with the usual courtesies of the living." It was as neat an epitaph as any case could require, and we had the wisdom to let it stand. The fog had lifted from Ashworth Hall, the truth had been revealed, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. In the end, perhaps that was all any mortal investigation could hope to achieve. Not perfect understanding of the human heart, but sufficient clarity to distinguish between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal, between the justice that heals and the certainty that destroys. The little grey cells had done their work once more, and London slept more peacefully for their efforts. The weeks following Dr. Hartwell's arrest brought to Ashworth Hall a quality of peace that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, as though the ancient house had finally exhaled after holding its breath through decades of accumulated secrets. The Gothic shadows that had once harbored whispers of unfinished business now appeared merely picturesque, and the fog that rolled across the grounds on winter evenings no longer carried the weight of supernatural menace. The healing of Ashworth Hall. Lady Ashworth moved through her daily routines with a newfound dignity, her grief tempered by the relief that comes from knowing the truth, however painful. The elaborate deceptions that had dominated that extraordinary November evening had given way to honest conversation and practical planning. Charles, chastened by his father's death and the revelation of Dr. Hartwell's betrayal, threw himself into assisting with the estate's affairs with a dedication that would have surprised his father. "It is remarkable," Poirot observed to me one afternoon as we prepared for our final departure, "how truth, once revealed, transforms not merely the facts of a situation, but the very atmosphere in which people live. The psychological poison that infected this house has been drawn out, and now healing can begin." Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, her elaborate posthumous investigation having served its purpose, found unexpected peace in her new role with the Temple Foundation. Her intimate knowledge of Lord Ashworth's collection and her meticulous nature made her invaluable to the transition, though she confessed to occasional dreams where her former master dictated correspondence that became increasingly illegible as she wrote. 30 years of devotion, Poirot reflected, channeled at last toward a purpose that honors both the dead and the living. She has learned, perhaps, that the most faithful service sometimes requires the courage to question rather than simply to obey. The transformation of legacy. Spring brought with it an invitation that would have seemed impossible during those dark November days, a request from Miss Violet Ashworth to attend the formal opening of the Ashworth wing of the Temple Foundation. The ceremony, held on a bright May morning, revealed the remarkable transformation of Lord Ashworth's private obsession into a public treasure. The foundation occupied a dignified building of honeyed stone, its halls holding the hush peculiar to places that tend collections of old things and careful thoughts. The Ashworth wing opened upon a gallery of cool proportions where oak cases displayed ancient treasures with scholarly precision, their labels printed without flourish yet rich with learning. Miss Violet met us at the threshold with a poise that combined inherited grace with hard-won wisdom. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, welcome. You will find that everything is, if not perfectly in order, at least arranged with honest intentions." As we moved through the gallery, Poirot paused before an Etruscan fibula that gleamed like captured moonbeam, then before a display case containing a signet ring, not Lord Ashworth's, but cousin to it in purpose and authority. When a young curator with startled hair and determined pince-nez began explaining the ring's provenance, Poirot gently corrected a minor dating error with characteristic precision. "The intaglio's treatment of the laurel," he observed kindly, "suggests a date 10 years later than your label indicates. Reduce your certainty by a decade, and you will be exactly correct." The young scholar flushed, then grinned. "They told me you would notice the smallest detail, Monsieur Poirot. I see they understated the case." The philosophical reflection. At the ceremony's conclusion, Lady Ashworth addressed the small gathering with quiet authority. "This wing is not an act of penitence," she said, "nor is it a monument to tyranny. It is simply the transformation of possession into stewardship. If there is wisdom in my husband's legacy, it lies in that distinction." Later, in the Foundation's quiet reading room, Miss Violet drew us aside for tea and reflection. "I have sometimes wondered," she said thoughtfully, "about that phrase Mrs. Fairchild used, 'The account must be settled.' It frightened me at first, yet afterward I thought perhaps it was meant to save rather than condemn." Poirot nodded with understanding. The phrase belonged to Lord Ashworth's business vocabulary, but Mrs. Fairchild appropriated it with great psychological insight. She sent it to those whose fear of accounting would reveal their souls. But there was one to whom it was sent for another reason entirely. He turned to me with that familiar twinkle I'd learned to regard with suspicion. "To you, mon ami. The honest man keeps the murderer steady merely by being present. Mrs. Fairchild requested your forthright nature, because guilt in the company of guile can perform its deceptions, but guilt in the company of candor must eventually confess." The enduring lessons. As the months passed and the Ashworth case took its place among the many extraordinary investigations that had marked our partnership, I noticed that Poirot's approach to subsequent cases had acquired a new dimension of philosophical depth. His legendary precision remained intact, but it was now tempered by a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human motivation and the dangers of absolute certainty. "The little grey cells," he explained one evening as we reviewed a particularly complex fraud case, "are magnificent instruments for discovering truth, but they must be guided by wisdom rather than mere cleverness. The Ashworth case taught me that the most dangerous criminals are often those who commit their crimes with the clearest consciences, convinced of their own righteousness." The case had revealed not merely the mechanics of murder disguised as medicine, but the profound psychological truth that loyalty without wisdom, conviction without humility, and justice without mercy could transform the noblest impulses into instruments of destruction. The final departure. On our last morning at Ashworth Hall, as we prepared for the journey back to London, the hired motor car waiting by the grand entrance, I glanced back at the imposing facade that had witnessed such extraordinary events. It no longer seemed a place of sinister secrets, but rather a testament to the enduring complexities of human nature. A place where love and betrayal, loyalty and ambition had intertwined in a drama as old as humanity itself. Poirot, ever punctual, was already settled in the back seat, adjusting his hat to a precise angle. As I joined him, he looked at me with characteristic amusement. "So, Hastings," he began, "you have once again witnessed the triumph of the little grey cells. You have seen how a dead man's invitation can lead to the exposure of a living man's crime. And what, mon ami, is your profound conclusion from this extraordinary affair?" I considered the elaborate deceptions, the psychological games, the very real human suffering we had witnessed. "My conclusion, Poirot," I said finally, "is that dinner parties, especially those hosted by the recently deceased, are perhaps best avoided in future." Poirot chuckled, a rare and delightful sound. "Ah, Hastings, ever the pragmatist, but for Hercule Poirot, such invitations are merely the preamble to the most fascinating of human performances. They are the curtain raisers to the grand opera of motive and deception." He paused, a wry smile playing on his lips. "However, I confess I do prefer my hosts to be capable of carving the roast with the usual courtesies of the living. It makes for far less complicated dining and significantly fewer demands upon the digestion of my little grey cells." Epilogue. The lasting truth. As our motor car pulled away from Ashworth Hall for the final time, leaving behind the echoes of a mystery solved and a truth revealed, I reflected on the profound lessons the case had taught us both. The fog had lifted not merely from the Surrey countryside, but from the very souls of those touched by the affair. We had learned that the dead can only haunt us with our permission, and that the most effective exorcism is often simply the patient work of living well. The dinner invitation signed by the dead had ultimately been an invitation to confront our own limitations, as investigators, as human beings, as fallible creatures seeking truth in an uncertain world. Justice had been served, not through the elaborate posthumous tribunal orchestrated by Mrs. Fairchild, but through the careful application of reason tempered by compassion, certainty balanced by humility. In the end, the most valuable truth was perhaps the recognition that we are all, in our various ways, guests at a dinner table where the ultimate host remains forever mysterious, and where the final accounting lies beyond the reach of even the most penetrating investigation. The affair at Ashworth Hall was closed, but its lessons would endure as long as human beings continued to struggle with the eternal questions of justice, loyalty, and the dangerous allure of absolute certainty. And that, as Poirot would undoubtedly observe, is a mystery worthy of our continued attention, though preferably served at tables where the host can be relied upon to remain present for the duration of the meal.